Hello and welcome to SI Tutorials. My name is Anthony Williams and I will be your host. This video is part of a two-part series looking at Adobe Connect functionality. And in this video we will actually look at the meeting room itself and talk about the functionality of the meeting room. So the first thing you want to do, of course, is to sign into Adobe Connect. That's connect.capella.edu. And then you're going to click the button. If you don't see this, if this screen here is not visible, then make sure you have My Meetings chosen, because sometimes it'll default to one of these other tabs and you won't see these meetings listed here. So click on My Meetings if it doesn't show, and then click the Open button for the meeting room that you want to open. Give that a moment to load. Okay, so first, going into your meeting room, especially if you're looking to make changes or whatever, just go ahead. This will come up automatically. You can always start this at any time, so just click cancel to begin with, and that'll free you up to do other things. First thing, chat pod over here, you can clear the chat. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So there's menu items up here at the top. And each of those have some very useful functions. And then each of these pods also has a menu, as you just saw with the chat pod. And this is the attendees pod. And so I'm going to go through each of these things one by one. I'm actually going to, okay, so meeting room, your meeting option in your menu gives you certain menu options. You would probably never use these three at the top. You can block guest access, but I would not recommend that. Preferences is actually very useful. For one thing, you can create a background image so that you have a background, otherwise it's just plain old dark gray. You can show your cursor to everyone, or only to other hosts, or only to attendees when using a whiteboard. In other words, they're going to see your cursor moving. It's not perfect, so if you put it over this here, it's actually going to show up to them just a little bit lower than that. It probably depends a lot on their display as well as what they're looking at. So you have a few things here. You can do display names. That probably wouldn't mess with that. The audio conference, you probably won't mess with that, because that's actually controlled through the home page. Your video, unless you plan to do a webcam presentation, you probably won't need that. Microphone is not used since you have the PGI Global Meet, and that's just used through the phone. Screen share just shows your cursor. You have a mini control panel that'll show up when you're in screen. When you're sharing your screen, there'll be a little mini control panel. I will actually show you that when we get to the share pod. Attendees pods, you can disable raise hand, which I would not do. You can persist in screen share, which I would leave alone. Essentially, there's going to be a notification timer that'll show up down in the corner, in the lower left-hand or right-hand corner, and you can choose how long it stays up. That's basically to let you know as you're doing your meeting, it'll pop up, so you'll see that somebody has raised their hand. Chat pod, you can enable or disable private chat for participants. If you're hosting the room by yourself, I honestly recommend that you disable that feature. What can happen is that learners will send private chats to you, and of course you have to either answer them, with your voice, or you have to go into there and you have to type in. So it's not real useful. I usually recommend to learners, if they have questions that are of a more personal nature that they don't want to share with the room, that they just send me a course message and then I'll get back to them that way. But you can handle that however you wish. Show and hide names, I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mess with that. And a whiteboard, which I don't use whiteboard very often because there is actually a whiteboard feature in the SharePod itself when you're sharing documents. So whiteboard feature is not usually extremely useful. You might find it useful though for your purposes, depending on what you're doing. If they are actually doing math by hand, for example, you might use the whiteboard because the whiteboard allows the participants to scribble on the whiteboard as well. So it might actually come in handy for some applications. Okay, so that's our preferences. Okay, so you have your audio setup wizard. I wouldn't mess with that. You have record meeting, which as soon as you're ready to record your meeting, you just choose that, and it will bring up a screen. As I actually mentioned in part 1, you want to make sure that you name your recording something that you're going to recognize. So you want to keep it with, you want to make sure that you got your quarter in here. This is the way I usually do it. I do the SI and then Q4 and then the year, and then say this is the 5th week and it's the second part of that. That's the second session for that week. I will do something like that. And of course that's up to you how you want to do that, but you want to name them in such a way that you actually can keep track of which one is which. And then you just click OK and it'll start the meeting. Now, once the meeting is started, there will actually be an option under where it says record meeting to stop meeting. I think you also have a pause meeting option, so you can pause the meeting. If you don't want to stop the recording, you can pause it and then just pick up where you decide to pick up at. Enable presenter area is essentially an option that will allow you to do things in your basically you can pull pods up over here and you can mess around with the pods without anybody seeing them, and then you just drag it. When you're done, you can drag it over. For some reason that's not working, but you drag it over into your pod area and it'll be there for them. Disable. Full screen just makes, of course, the thing go full screen. You can actually do that with each of your pods as well. It's helpful, especially if you have a participant sharing their screen. You can actually use the full screen option. It helps you read things a little bit better. I know if people with bad eyesight like me, that's usually very helpful. And then end meeting is essentially to end the whole meeting. It'll end everything. I don't recommend using it that way. I would just do stop your meeting instead of stop recording, essentially, instead of the end meeting. And then of course you can exit Adobe Connect. Okay, so the next one is your layouts. Now, layouts will appear over at the side here in this little sidebar. Okay. Now, the thing about layouts, I don't really use layouts, but they can be helpful if you have different setups for different portions of your session. You can create those. You can create the setup, the layout, essentially, with all the chat pod or all the little pods that you want in there. You can, and then you just click over to. Let me do something like this. Let me add one here. Okay, so this is a new layout, and then of course you put your pods in, and essentially what happens is when you switch from layout to layout, it'll actually keep the content that you have already loaded. So it actually can be very useful for quickly switching over to a different setup. Like I said, I don't use layouts very often, so I don't really know a whole lot about it. So you might want to play around with that and see how best you can use that with your meetings. Okay, so pods. Now this is the one that you'll use the most often. Your pods are essentially these things here. This is where you create them. If you just go and you hover over the sort of pod that you want, you can add new, or you can choose to bring up ones that you already have open. And then you can hide it again as well, so you can get it out of the way. In order to use a share pod, essentially you have three options. You have share my screen, share document, and share whiteboard. Share my screen, of course, is going to give you the option to share your entire screen with the room. You can either do desktop or you can do applications by themselves. Applications might be useful if you don't want everyone to see everything that's on your desktop, but if you need to switch between applications, desktop is the way you want to go. And then just click share, and that will share that screen, whatever you've chosen. It'll share it with the whole room so all the participants can see that. The other option is share document, and that opens this window, and essentially you have different things that you can share here. Most often you're going to just share content, and this goes back to, in part 1 we showed you how to do the content, how to load the content into your, create folders for your content and things like that. Essentially you just double click to select your folder, and then you just select your whichever thing you want to bring up. And then in order to get rid of that and yet keep the pod open, you just click stop sharing. And you also have an option to draw. So you have drawing. You can change the colors, so you can draw on it. You can create shapes. There's various shapes you can create here, and you can change. I use stars every once in a while. I'll be like, okay, Mallory gets a star, and then I'll just click a star in there. Just a cute little thing to keep them kind of paying attention. And you have a text one too, so you can actually type text in there. Oops. And then you can also use this back button to just get rid of everything you just did. Another thing that you can do, let me show you this with the drawing tool. So if you draw something and then you go past, so if you're in your slides, for example, when you move on to the next slide, when you go back to the previous slide, you're not going to be able to use this undo button anymore. But you can use the selection tool to select the item and then just click delete, or you can use the little trash can option as well. And that pretty much explains that. So stop sharing gets rid of that, and then you have a whiteboard feature as well. And the whiteboard then essentially allows the same drawing options that you have with your normal share, your document share, but it allows other people to use it as well. And you probably have to go up here to preferences in the whiteboard, and you have to enable participants to draw, enable participants to export, etc., depending on what you want to allow them to do. And that's pretty much all there is to the sharing pod. Notes pod is really simple. It's basically only just a blank thing that you can type in, and as you type they will see what you are typing. So that's useful, of course, you'll use that for your dial-in info. Is actually a notes pod. Your legal disclaimer is also a notes pod. In order to change, by the way, in order to change the labels for them, you just double click in it, and then you can change it to whatever you want. And of course, when you close it, when you hide it, it's actually still going to be available up here. So you can see we have the notes, the empty notes right here. We have the legal disclaimer, the dial-in info, and other options here for different sorts of things. Your attendees pod, of course, is visible by default. You can actually choose to get rid of that if you wish, but I don't recommend it. I recommend that you keep that up at all times. That way you can see when students raise their hand. If you happen to miss the little window that'll open up down here, it'll last for between 5 and 8 seconds. You're allowed to make it last that long. But if you happen to miss it, you'll see the little raised hand over here. I'm actually going to come into the room as another person here so that I can show you some other features with the attendees pod. Okay, video is basically webcam chat, so if you want to use that, you can. I have never used the webcam, so I'm not really sure exactly all the functionality of it, but you will have to check that out for yourself. You only have one chat pod, of course. This is where they can communicate with you. Normally, when you have a lot of learners in your session, you don't want to have everybody not on mute, because what basically happens is you have all this background noise going on. It can be very distracting, not just for you, but for the learners. So I recommend having everybody mute their phone, and when they have questions, they just type them in the chat pod, and then you can answer them, audibly. Let's see here, files. Okay, the files pod, I have one open here already. I essentially make a files pod for each of my units, and then I keep all those files loaded in them already. As you can see here, I have all of the units already listed. And so essentially what that does is all you have to do is call it up, and it's there, it already loaded with whatever you're presenting to them as files. And again, you can always hide those. Now, the files pod has a couple options. You can maximize it, which I probably never use. You can upload a file, in which case it'll open up that dialog window that we saw before. You select your content, and then you can put just about anything in there. Anything that Adobe allows, you can essentially create, you can use it, you can put it in the files pod for them to download for themselves. Now, I don't actually give them the PowerPoints themselves, but I do use the export feature of PowerPoint to create a PDF. And so that's why you'll see Unit 1 PDF, but you'll also see this is the actual presentation, the PowerPoint presentation here, but there's a PDF of those slides here, and that's what I share in the files pod. So that's how you share, that's how you upload files. And of course you can also remove and rename selected files as well. And then you have an option to download all as well. Now essentially for them to use it, all they have to do is highlight it and just click download file. It'll open a window, and they just have to click to download, and it'll download it right to their computer. Alright, so our next one is web links. Now, I don't use web links anymore because what I did was I just created a PDF with all of the links in it, so that way they have access to that, they can download it, and they can keep it for themselves. However, if you decide to use the links pod, essentially all there is to it is just you can add a link. You just type in the URL path, so whatever the URL is, and then name it, and click OK, and that will create your link. And in order to get to it, you just highlight it and click Browse To, and it'll take you right to the link. It can actually be very useful. The one major problem with it is that they have to click out of the room in order to use that function. So in other words, if they're going to open a link, it's going to open up in their browser, and now they're no longer looking at your session. So that's one of the reasons that I decided to quit using the links pod and use PDFs for all the links instead. And that way they can save the PDF's links file, and they can access it whenever they want, but it's not taking away from your session. Okay, hide that. So that's pretty much the web links. Polls are kind of interesting, however you have to do them one at a time. An easier way to do polls is actually, so you either have a select one option, so you have A, B, C, D, or you have a true and false option where they just have true and false. And then what I do is I use PowerPoints to do the actual quiz. And the quiz will, you'll have the quiz question on the PowerPoints, and they'll just answer in the poll pod. And of course, selecting those will give you a percentage as well as show you how many actual students selected each one. So you can do little quizzes. They're actually very useful because you can get some feedback as far as seeing where the students are with the particular content. And then if there's students that didn't get the answer right, you can explain afterwards. So those can be very useful. And then Q&A, which is something I have not used, so you might want to check that out and see what functionality that has. I honestly don't know. And then here at the bottom, there's a Manage Pods. Okay, and this is where you get rid of the pods that you are not using anymore. So like I just created this Notes 20, I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And of course you can select using your Control or your Shift buttons, you can select more than one and it will delete all of those. And so that way you can actually manage your pods so that you don't have so many pods, because essentially what it does, every time you hide one or every time you create one, it'll stay in existence. It'll still exist until you get rid of it using that Manage Pods option. Okay, so that's pods. All right, audio is simply to start your audio meeting. Really very simple. It starts it like so. Now basically they have two options. They can put their phone number in this field right here and click join, and the system will actually call their phone. And so all they have to do is answer it. That's what I recommend for them to do, because their phone number doesn't show up in the chat. However, it doesn't always show up and it doesn't persist forever. So eventually this, if the student isn't sitting there and they sit down later, they may not have this window showing once you start the meeting. And so they need to have the option to dial in as well. And so when you click choose the dial in option, it actually gives you the numbers and the participant code to call in. And of course we have all this information already up here in the dial in info pod, which I highly recommend. And I just leave that up there, and if anybody is in the chat pod and they say, oh, I can't hear anything, basically you just tell them to you have to type it in the chat pod, of course, because they can't hear you. So you just type something in the chat pod with the instructions to use the dial-in info in the upper right hand or lower left hand corner, wherever you've put it, to dial into the meeting so that that person can hear. Okay, so let's go back to the attendees pod here. I want to show you what you can actually do, a few things here. Okay, so one thing you can do is, let me actually start that meeting again. I want to actually try something here. Bear with me just a moment. I'm actually having it call my number, but I'm doing it on this other account, this Michael person. That's actually me. So I'm having it dial my phone. Okay, for some reason that didn't work. Okay, let me do it this way. I just want to show you one particular function which will be very, very useful. It doesn't show up though unless I have somebody actually called into the meeting. And it's basically the ability to mute that person or mute everyone. Okay, so Michael is preparing to dial in. Okay, and you can see when one person dials in, it essentially starts to dial everybody. Okay, so now that now we have that number showing. Okay, so this is going to give you some options here, and that is to mute all users. Okay, now when you do that, this is what they're going to hear, just so you can hear this.
Mute on.
Okay, so when you mute all your users, everyone is going to hear that. So just keep that in mind, so that when you use that function, that you let everybody know. You just tell everybody, okay, I just muted everybody's phones, so don't don't panic. That was just me muting everyone's phones because I have a couple people who haven't muted their phones and it's causing a lot of background noise or something similar. And you can
Mute off.
unmute as well. And you can also, this feature is not, okay, if they dial in for themselves. Now this is why the mute everyone is the one that you'll use the most often. What you can also do is you can actually, I'm going to go ahead and hang that up. You can actually mute the user. When you hover over their name, you will have an option here to mute the user. And that will mute individual users. But the problem with that is you can only do that for those users who have allowed the system to dial them. In other words, you saw a separate phone number there. That means that that person has not allowed the system to dial them. They've dialed in themselves, and you don't have any control over. In other words, you can't highlight the number itself and select mute the user. It doesn't work. So you have to use the mute all users function in order to do that in your attendees options there. Another really handy thing, and this is especially handy if you have to work with a participant on a one-to-one basis, is that you can request a screen share from them. And essentially what that's going to do is there's going to be a black box that appears over here. It's going to say start. And then the white box will come up. So when we shared our screen, we had this, and then this box will come up for them too. And then they click the share button. So keep that in mind if you use the share option, so that you know how to direct them as far as what they need to click in order to share their screen. And that can actually be very useful. The other thing is you can clear everybody's status. And you can also, if you select a person, you can change their role. You can change their role here or just by hovering over their name. And you can remove the selected user. So if you have somebody in there that's causing, like being rude to people or something like that, you can actually remove the user from the room. I don't know that anything else here is necessarily real useful. Here, for example, is some of the stuff that you can use for attendees pod. It doesn't really do much, however. It's already set up by default to do these things. So, and you'll probably want to leave those alone because you want to actually have them be able to raise their hand and get the notification for that. And so that's pretty much all of the pod stuff. I wanted to show you one other thing. So if I do the share my screen option, you can see that we have this little window has popped up over here. Now it'll fall down, as it were, like that. And this is just it's just black on the participant's screen. So it's just like a black box sitting there on the participant screen. But when you open it up, like so, it's a bigger black box. In other words, it's all blacked out on their screen, but they can actually see there is something actually in the way. So wherever it is on your screen, it's on their screen too in that spot. So keep that in mind. But I wanted to show you a couple things. For one thing, you have the option to see the chat while you are actually in screen share, so you can still see what they're typing in the chat pod. I'll show you this. All right, so it actually shows up in the chat pod, and you can look at that anytime you need to. This is the notifications, so if somebody raises their hand, you'll know. This will show you the attendees pod. These other ones are not really used at all because you don't use the audio because you're actually using the phone. And then this one brings up the option, so you can either pause. You could pause and then go in there, and it'll take you right back to the room, but it'll still keep that screen share alive. So essentially what happens here is I've got that screen share sitting in front of me, right? Whatever was in front of you when you click that button will come up on here, and then you can actually draw on it. So that can actually be useful. And then you just click resume, and that takes you back to the screen share where you can move around in it. And then you just stop sharing in order to end that screen share. And that is pretty much it. Just make sure in your room that you have your legal disclaimer that you have your dial-in info. You should have a chat pod. You should have an attendees pod. And then, of course, you have your main area for your sharing and your to share your documents and whatnot. And then you want to leave a little space too to have a files pod at least. And you may choose to have a links pod as well. And that's just up to you. Oh, chat pod. Here's one other thing I forgot to show you. You can actually clear the chat. I showed you that at the beginning. You can actually change your text size and your chat color. And I usually make my chat color different, and that way they know it's me. Just even without looking at the name, they can tell it's me. So you can do that. You can show timestamps so that you know when each post was made. Don't necessarily need that, but it can come in handy if you wanted to see how long ago a person asked a question or something like that. Chat sounds is essentially going to, let me make sure I have my speakers on. So that's essentially what happens with chat sounds. So anytime anybody chats, and of course that can be extremely annoying, so I probably wouldn't do that either. And then of course if you click preferences, it takes you to the chat pod preferences, which you can enable private chat or not. And that's pretty much it for the room itself. One other thing I want to show you, however, is I want to show you my recording room so you have an idea when you go to create your own of how you can set it up. Now obviously you can set it up any way you like, but this is the way I do mine. As you can see, I'm using links here, and these are simply links to the recordings, which you get by going into meetings. You go to that room where you created the recording, go to recordings, and then just click on the recording of your choice, and there's the URL. And you can see the URL will be the same. And it's just a matter of, you go up here, it's just what I showed you before. You do the add link thing, put your URL in there and name it. As you can see, I name them according to the day and the date, and the part number and the unit number, so that the users the participants can look at that and they can go, oh, this is that particular session. And then I have reminders and announcements over here. This is nothing more than a notes pod, and I just created some information over there. Let me see here. And I mean, everything else is pretty much self-explanatory. Of course, I have the unit PDFs on here, which this is a files pod down here, so I put the unit PDFs and a couple other PDFs that were useful. I basically put the unit PDFs and the unit links PDFs in there. And I haven't updated that in a while. I need to do that. In fact, let's just go ahead and I'll show you how to do that again. So I don't have unit 3, so let's put unit 3 PDF in there. And let's put unit 3 PDF links in there. And so it just populates it like so. And that is really all there is to it. That's the actual meeting room itself. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me via email. And I thank you for watching.